IM Van Delft played e4. Vidit replied with c5, knight f3, e6, d4, takes, takes, and knight c6. Knight c3, pawn a6, takes, takes, bishop d3, d5. So in this Sicilian, Vidit gets his pawns forward and gets a d5 break quickly. Castles, knight f6. If e5, the pawn just becomes a weakness, and the bishop would anyway develop to b7 and then c5. So queen f3, bishop e7, still not afraid of e5. Queen g3, hinting at bishop h6 if castling happens. So Vidit first plays knight h5, attacking the queen. Queen moves. The IM repeats. Vidit comes back, and the IM is ready for the draw, even with the white pieces, because the rating difference is a bit huge. Vidit cannot afford a draw. He goes for castles. Bishop h6, knight e8. The bishop has to go back because either way king h8 was going to come. And now f6. Vidit is all ready to play e5 and d4 and get these pawns rolling. Rook d1, king h8 first, getting out of the pin. Bishop went all the way back. Knight d6, king h1. Knight f7, getting ready to push e5 and also keep the option of knight e5 handy. Rook e8, e1, pawn d4, attacking the knight, knight moves e5, and c3, c5. So you can see the beautiful pawn structure for Vidit. And here b4 was played. This is where a crazy sequence of moves start. Vidit plays pawn takes c3, opening up a discovered attack on his queen, allowing bishop takes pawn. And he plays knight d6. Bishop takes bishop. Vidit could have taken back here with, let's say, rook into c8, and things would be fine. It would be an equal position. But Vidit goes for more. He plays c2. Rook takes knight. Opponent gives up his rook for a bishop and a knight, because already he had taken a bishop and now the rook took a knight. So it is two pieces at the cost of a rook, which is supposed to be good for the two pieces. But then there is also a passed pawn on c2 and the rook is active. So bishop b7 attacking the rook. Vidit just plays queen d1, threatening the rook, and if rook takes, there is pawn takes back queens. Pawn f3, defending his rook. A better move in this position would have been pawn f4, but it wouldn't change much. It just gains a little bit more space. Pawn f3, pawn takes b4. Bishop d5, opponent does not go for bishop takes rook because then rook takes back and the a2 pawn would fall. And then there would be two connected pass pawns. Rook d8, just activating his rook. Bishop b3. Opponent goes for stability. The bishop stays there, controlling everything, especially the a2 pawn, and stopping the b pawn. Bishop c5. Vidit activates the last piece he had. All the other pieces are already good. Pawn h4. Here Vidit goes for queen takes, rook d1, which is basically an exchange of queens. It also loses the passed c pawn, right? But Vidit gets the a pawn. He correctly evaluated this position to be good for him, even though it is still two pieces for a rook. Normally that would be good for white, but here there is still a pass pawn. And Vidit plays b3. If bishop takes pawn, which is the best move, rook takes knight. And if bishop does not take the pawn, b2 is coming. So bishop takes pawn, rook takes b3, rook takes e2, king h2, bishop b4, bishop f7, and now comes rook e1. Attacking the bishop is completely trapped. Rook b1, and the bishop is gone. Here, his opponent, the IM, resigned, and Vidit won his first round. In the second round, Vidit was facing Jens Jelmer, a 2410 rated player, and Vidit played d4, queen's pawn. And opponent played the Dutch defense, a provocative opening, an aggressive opening, not completely sound as considered by most GMs, but yeah, it's an option, even at the top level. Bishop g5, pawn g6, knight out, bishop g7, knight f3, knight f6, e3, bishop c4, knight c6, castles, knight a5, attacking the bishop, bishop moves, castles. So black has taken some risks, especially the weak squares over here, to get a position like this, to get a chance to defeat the top player. Queen e2, Vidit is getting ready to play e4. He wants e4 as fast as possible. Pawn h6, takes, takes, and e4. And once white gets the central break, the Dutch player is in trouble. Pawn e6, rook d1, bishop goes back, rook e1. All the pieces are developed, very simple chess. Bishop d7 and takes. Takes back, queen d2, keeping an eye on h6. Knight c6, the knight goes back to a better place. Bishop c4, hitting e6, provoking d5. Bishop goes to b5, knight moves, takes, takes. And now as you can see, there is a weakness over here. The e6 pawn is backward and weak. So Vidit reroutes his pieces to the best places to attack e6. Knight g6, pawn h4. First he wants to kick the knight and then play knight f4. If black plays h5, there will be a good square for the knight on g5 as well. So rook e8, h5. The knight is kicked and here comes knight f4. e5 is still not possible because there are 3 pieces stopping it and there's only 2 pieces defending it. So knight h7, knight e5. Takes, takes. Knight g5, rook e1. As you can see, there are now 3 pieces attacking it and there are 3 pieces defending it as well. Pawn c6, giving extra support for d5. Queen also jumps into the party, which makes black defend with the king. So now 4 pieces attacking and there are 4 pieces defending, right? So Vidit could not find a way to break through there. He plays queen d3, knight e4, f3, knight back, and c4. Takes, takes. There is even more pressure now on the e6 square from this diagonal. King f6, queen c3, king f7. So opponent just repeats just to check if Vidit is interested in a draw. Vidit also repeats twice. And now he plays knight g6. The engine prefers Vidit to go back to c3 and after king f7 play a move like rook d1, trying to play d5. But okay, he plays knight g6, rook d8, and now rook d1 was played. Here it was possible for Vidit to play d5 actually. It looks a little difficult, but the point is the e pawn cannot take on d5 because now queen f4 and f5 square would be under attack. The king is not safe. It is defended right now. So for example, c5, we would play knight e7. That is a tough move to find. Or even knight h4 looks good. Yeah, just knight h4. This is a normal way to attack the f5 pawn. And the problem is you can't defend it. So that is tough to see that d5 is possible. A more human move is rook d1. King knight f7, attacking the rook. Queen c3. Of course, you can't take the rook because pawn takes rook opens up the queen and it's a check when the pawn takes it. So king g7. Now the rook is under attack. Rook moves. Rook e2 so that the other rook can come to e1 if required. King h7. Pawn b4. We did this gaining space on the queen side as well. Queen g3. Queen e1. Because white has a better pieces and the pawn structure, it would be bad for black to exchange queens. He goes back and f4. Telling the queen you're no longer allowed on the king side, on my king side. Queen d7, rook d3. Rerouting the rook to g3. Knight d6, a4, knight c4, queen h4. Trying to get the queen into the attack. Queen f7, stopping queen f6. Pawn b5, gaining more space. Now knight d6. Rook b2. So here the time trouble is soon approaching. You can see both of them are on around 15 minutes. King h2, knight e4, rook c2, knight f6, knight e5. And now black has also regrouped his pieces to create threats on Vidit's king. g2 is defended by the rook. For now, rook c3, knight d5, stopping rook c7. Rook g3, takes, and takes. So Vidit is okay with an equal position. He believes in his knight and the better rook. Rook a8. That's a very nice move by Jens Jelmer. He wants to push the a pawn and get a pass pawn. So knight d7 and a5. Takes, rook b8. Rook check. Sorry, rook b2. Rook check. King moves. Knight takes pawn. So the pawn goes, but so does the b pawn. And now king g8, getting out of the discovered attack. Knight f6. The king is now caught on the last rank. King moves. Of course, you cannot go to h8 because there is the Arabian mate on h7. King f8, rook h7. Rook check, king moves, knight takes g2, but knight check, king moves, knight c5, attacking e6. Knight check, king moves, rook moves to e2. and rook takes h6. King f7, which is a decisive mistake because king e7 would have allowed the king to be more active. But king h7, king f7, rook check, and the king is again doomed to the last rank. And now rook d7, rook c2. The white king is ready to jump into the attack. So the opponent is down on his last few seconds, and here he made this big mistake of moving the rook because that allows knight e6, and after rook h2, king f5, and the position is just great for Vidit. It's completely lost for black because king g6 is coming, h6 is coming, rook check, it's gonna be all over. So rook takes pawn, and now king g6, and Vidit wins. Opponent resigns because there is mate or lose the rook. In the third round, Vidit was facing Viktor Mikhailevsky, rated 2523, and he played Queen's Gambit declined. Knight out, knight out, knight out, bishop b4, queen a4, forcing knight c6, pawn e3, castles, queen c2, rook e8, and bishop d2. White is delayed the taking out of the bishop. He is getting ready for casting long. Bishop comes to f8. Bishop e2, knight b4, queen b1, takes, and b6. Pawn a3, bishop a6. So if bishop takes bishop, the knight would take back. And if pawn takes knight, bishop takes bishop. Bishop back, bishop takes, knight e4. Provoking e4, but now knight goes back, e5. This is where the white player decided to be aggressive. And Vidit was giving him the chance to be aggressive. And here comes knight g5, threatening mate on h7. So knight g6 was played, inviting h4. So it looks like it's a very tough position for black, but Vidit defends tenaciously. Bishop e7, rook h3, a rook lift, pawn c5, hitting in the center, rook g3, takes, h5, knight f8, knight f3, pawn d3, a very nice move. If queen takes it, the knight jumps in, offering an exchange of queens. He plays bishop h6, attacking g7, threatening rook g7, which would just be crushing. Because if king h8 after that, queen takes pawn, threatens mate, almost mate again, except for the knight that is defending. And bishop g7 is another big threat. That would be even stronger because then the king would be stuck and bishop takes knight comes. So g6, queen takes d3, knight c5, queen e3. And here Vidit got queen d3 in. So he has killed the attack by exchanging the queens. Knight d4. If white refuses to exchange queens and goes to f4, there's no point because we'll just continue to offer the exchange of queens. And the queen cannot go to d2 because of knight b3. After queen e3, knight d4, takes, and rook c8. Now it's an endgame, but black's pieces are still a bit passive. And this bishop is too strong. So Vidit takes on h5, b4, knight d7, knight c6. Look at that knight sitting in the center of the board. Knight g6. And Vidit plays bishop f8, immediately trying to exchange of this strong bishop. Bishop takes, king d2, and rook c7. Rook d3. And here Vidit played a very nice move to kill this knight's activity, knight c5. Forcing an exchange basically. Because if you take it, rook takes knight. And if you move your rook, then the knight anyway hangs. So knight takes a7 was played. Knight takes rook takes rook, knight f4, takes and takes. So now we have a rook and knight endgame with material one pawn up for Vidit, but it's a double pawn. Knight b5, knight takes g2. The double pawns are now passed as well. Knight d6, rook e7, rook check, king moves, and a4. Even this looks like it's good for white because white gets an outside pass pawn, but so is black's pass pawn. It is also an outside pass pawn. Knight comes back, push, takes, and h4. King moves, knight check. King moves, rook a7. Rook c5, defending the pawn, and pawn h5, stopping the king from coming to the g4 square. Knight f5 check, a very nice move because if you take, it's a rook endgame and it's drawish. So king g6, knight takes, king g5, and king g3, rook b7, getting the rook active, inviting the pawn to go forward. But if you move the pawn, you lose the knight, right? Rook check, you don't lose the knight, rook check, there is knight f3. So probably rook a7 looks good. Rook a7, if rook c6, then knight b5, knight b4, and then the pawn would just fall. So that's a tricky move by Vidit, inviting the a pawn to go forward. Opponent goes knight f3, king f5, knight check, king takes, pawn push, and now rook a7, stopping that pawn. Knight check, king d6. This was very brave, good calculation by Vidit, because one miscalculation and it's gone. It's a fork, but king d6 attacks the other rook as well. Knight takes, king takes. And now we have a knight endgame with two extra pawns for Vidit. The knight moves, clearing the path for the pawn and stopping the king from entering. And now f5. Pawn push, knight c7. Stopping the pawn. Here, king f4 was played. The correct move would have been activating the knight again. Then the knight would be in time to stop the pawns. For example, knight e7. And if black plays king b6, king h4, and this pawn falls. Right? But in the game, what happened was he played king f4, which allows h4. And it's not easy to attack this pawn again. Knight e7, but too late. King b6, knight g3, knight g6, and the pawn pushes. King g3, king takes pawn. King takes pawn, and now king comes back in time. King g3, king c5, king f4, and king comes in. Now, the pawn cannot push because the other pawn would fall. Knight f5, knight d5, kicking the king away. King g5, king e5, knight check, king d6. And now the pawn is ready to push. Actually, both the pawns are ready to push. Knight f8, pawn f4. King up, pawn push. Pawns are rolling, pawn push. It's very important for black to not allow the knight to sacrifice itself for two of the pawns. Then it's a draw. So the pawns are rolling up, and the king could not find a proper way like this. That took too much time. So he plays king f5, attacking the e pawn, but the f pawn runs. You can't take the pawn because the f2 pawn promotes. Knight comes back, and knight defends the pawn. And here you cannot take the pawn because the knight is defending it, and if king takes, pawn push. So here, opponent resigned, and Vidit won the game. In round 4, Vidit faced the young Norwegian, Arjen Tari, 2656 rated. And Vidit shows his versatility by playing the e4 move. In one of the rounds in this tournament, he had played d4. Here he plays e4, e5, knight out, and the scotch. The world champion also played the scotch in this tournament in the initial rounds. Takes, knight comes out, and knight takes knight. B takes back, knight d2, d5. Takes, and bishop b5. Takes, castles. So it's a simple enough position. Black gets slightly more control of the center, but white's pieces are also placed well to come out to good squares. b3 was played to get the bishop to b2. Castles, bishop b2. a5, a4. Queen f5. Rook comes in. Bishop f4, threatening queen f2. Sorry, bishop c5, threatening queen f2. Knight f3. Knight e4, again threatening f2, but rook e2. With it, it's like there is nothing happening here. You're just making all the noise for nothing. I'm just defending everything. Your pawn is weak. I'm fine. And my bishop is great. So rook e8, queen d3, pinning the knight somewhat. Pawn c6, and rook e1. And now with its plan is just knight d4 and then f3, kicking the knight away. Queen goes back, defending c6. Because if bishop takes knight, then it would be a great battery over here. So queen back, f3. Knight moves. And with this, happy to go to the endgame. Takes, queen takes, and king f1, stopping the queen from entering. It would actually be almost mate. But yeah, there is still queen f1, but then the position would be great for black. So king f1, queen c8, queen c3, attacking the bishop. Takes, threatening mate on g7. But yeah, knight f5, queen moves to d3. And here c5 comes. Of course, you can't take on d5 because then there's a fork and you lose the queen. So bishop c3, attacking the a pawn. And here c4 was played, which seems to be the decisive blunder. Here, black's best move would be just knight d4, inviting bishop takes knight, because then queen takes, it's a normal queen endgame, which is equal. Also, if bishop takes a5, then there is knight c2. And if queen takes, then there's this fork, queen check, and the bishop would go. So this was a tactical shot, this knight d4. But okay, he didn't find it. Arjen played c4. Takes, and queen moves. The a5 pawn is still hanging. Queen d7, trying to get the queen in. If bishop takes pawn, the queen would jump in. King e2, stopping queen d1. Knight d6, attacking the queen, not giving white the time to take on a5. Queen a8, and now the pawn is gone. Queen check, queen e5. So with this, a clean pawn up, And that too, it's a passed pawn with the help of the bishop. It's just completely good. Queen g6, and Vidit played king d1, defending the pawn. And after knight c8, Vidit played a move that forced instant resignation. He played queen g3. Now the exchange of queens is forced, and once that is done, it's going to be an easy endgame to win for Vidit. The queen cannot move away because there's mate on g7. So Aryan Tari resigned, and Vidit won the game right after queen g3. In round 5, Vidit faced the Super GM Richard Rapport, and he played e4, e5, knight out, and we have the Berlin defense by Vidit. Castles, knight takes pawn, and after a few moves, we have the Berlin endgame, where the queens are exchanged and we have double pawns, but a better pawn structure for black, and the two bishops also for black. Knight comes out, bishop e7, rook check. In return for all this, white has better pieces and the better king, basically. Black has some awkwardness related to the king's position, and because of that, the rook is also tied down. Bishop g5 takes, h6, knight goes back, g5, knight e2, king e7, rook moves, preparing to double on the d file, but just in time with the exchanges of the rooks. Takes, and we have a pure endgame. b3, defending the a2 pawn. Knight h4. So basically the idea is to reroute the knight to g6, where it can attack e5. Knight c5, bishop goes to c8. Knight d4, knight g6, attacking the pawn, but the pawn pushes forward, takes, and king e7. A small tactical shot, because if you take the pawn, then the knight is almost trapped. It is trapped. Just bishop d7. And now king d8 is coming, or actually king d6 is also there. So there is no way for the knight to get out, and the other knight cannot do anything. Instead, if you play king d7, then there is knight back, and the knight escapes. But after bishop d7, we cannot play king d8 yet. For example, if white plays king f1, we can just go king d6, and that is just winning the knight. So a small tactical shot there. He plays king e7, knight comes, and that tactics helps with it to get the king into the game. Knight d3 and knight exchange offered. Knight back, b5, gaining more space, a5, b4. So Vidit is making good use of his queenside majority. King f2, c5. Knight back, bishop f5. He takes, Vidit takes back, and now there is a clear majority of queenside pawns, and that can help Vidit win. He plays king d6, king e3, sorry, c5, pawn h3, and c4. Takes. Not a big blunder. It's a normal move to take, but white could also have played something like f4, because then pawn takes, king is active, and the kingside majority also comes into the game quickly, like bishop h7, and here you can just play g4, and now both sides have majorities on opposite sides. But Aryan played directly pawn takes, and after knight takes, the queenside majority is very strong. b3 is coming. King comes in, knight e5, knight a1, trying to get to b3 to create a blockade over here. So here Vidit played knight check, king moves, and then a4. So it's a slight improvement based on instead of directly playing a4. Knight comes in, king comes out. King back, king c4. Knight b2, king b5. So Vidit is preparing the push. a3, knight moves, bishop h7. Pawn g3, bishop g8. So he has rerouted the bishop to attack this pawn. Knight c1 only moves. So look at white's knights. Doomed to passivity over here. Pawn h5. Not allowing the break to happen easily. h4. If you play move like g4, then just h4 and everything is killed over here. There is no play. So h4, takes, and this pawn is easier to manage because it's closer to the center. So black can handle this pawn easily and chase this pawn down easily. But black's pawns are on the queen side, and it's almost a passed pawn that is on the outside. So it's difficult for white to capture those pawns easily. And there is a bishop to add to all the problems. The bishop can cover both sides easily. Knight d4, king comes in. King c4, knight comes back to d4, king c3, and the king enters. Pawn f4, knight g4. King comes out, knight check. King comes more in, knight check. He is inviting the king down, but then the king goes back. Knight comes back to c5, king moves, and now king b2. The a2 pawn is falling. Knight moves, bishop a2. Knight c6, attacking the b pawn, but bishop moves to f5, sorry, bishop to c4, and if knight takes pawn, there is bishop takes knight. Takes, and king moves, attacking the knight. And here, there is nothing for Richard Rapport to do, because if the knight moves, then just the pawn pushes. In round 6, Vidit, who's already on 5 out of 5, faced Yuri, who is rated 2658. And Vidit played d4. He switched back to d4. In the previous game, he had played e4 in the previous white game. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, and d5. So it is transposed to Queen's Gambit. Takes, decline. Takes, bishop g5, c6, e3, h6, bishop h4, bishop e7, bishop d3, castles, knight e2, so that the f pawn can push in the future. Castles, knight d7, a4, gaining space on the queen side, knight h5, forcing an exchange of bishops, offering an exchange of bishops, bishop takes, queen takes, and a4, a5, sorry. Knight f6, knight c1, rerouting the knight to the c5 square, a juicy square on the queen side. g6, black creates some weaknesses over here just to control the f5 square. Rook e1, bishop e6, f3. So Vidit is ready to play e4 or even g4, almost trapping the knight, but knight can go back to g7. Rook d8, and he goes a6, forcing b6. And now queen d2, knight g7, bishop f1, bishop f5, and here comes g4. Vidit is not afraid of any sacrifices on the king side. His king is a little open, but he has got enough pieces around him, and he's got more space and a good pawn structure. Here, opponent goes for the kill with bishop takes g4, sacrificing a piece. Vidit is not worried. He's already very confident after winning 5 games out of 5, and he takes, knight takes, and bishop h3, giving away one more pawn, which anyway could not be stopped. So now 3 pawns for the piece for the opponent. Knight d3, pawn c5. Opponent wants to open up the position because then he can get to the king. Knight b5, takes, and knight takes back. Rook d6. Here, a better move would have been queen f6, creeping into the king side, and then rook d6. He goes rook d6 and knight f4. So with its extra piece is doing a good job over there. Knight f4, queen g5, and knight g2, forcing exchanges. The rook cannot defend, so basically if the knight takes, then there's exchanges. So knight has to take, because if the knight moves, anyway exchange happens. So knight takes knight, and Vidit manages to exchange everything off. Takes, pawn takes queen, and king takes knight. And what is left is an extra bishop that is sitting pretty. But pawn f5, sort of killing that bishop. But then rook comes in. b5, rook takes pawn. Pawn g4. The bishop is trapped, but Vidit doesn't mind, because takes. If you look at the material, it is still 1 pawn down for Vidit. But the a pawn is too fast. Rook a8 check, king moves, and now pawn push. Rook a6 only move, and then knight b5. And now there is nothing for the opponent to do. Vidit just moves his rook and is already ready to promote. And the counterplay is still too slow, and the opponent just resigned here in lieu of pawn promotion. So after 6 rounds, Vidit is on 6 out of 6 with just 1 round to go.